course, Professor Adrian Papahagi doesn't need much introduction, but it's mainly for our international audience. I will say a few words about him. He's a professor at the Department of English Language and Literature at the Faculty of Letters of the Babes-Bolyai University in Cluj. He's a highly recognized scholar of classical and medieval studies. He's an erudite essayist and a reputed interpreter, translator of paleography, but also of modern literature, Shakespeare very much. And of course, he's, as I said, an interpreter of most major European languages, modern and old. He, as I said, so an erudite scholar, yet also a public personality, highly concerned with the matters of the polis, that is politics in the best of sense, I would say, the matters of, as Marcel Smets, I think would say, the matters of this togetherness, which is concerning us all tonight and these days, which only the city allows for such togetherness. So as I believe that Professor Papahagi already took a lot of notes and has a lot of ideas prepared, with no further ado, I would please invite you to start the dialogue.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me. Now, from this introduction, you realize I have nothing to do with this gathering. Why am I here? That's the first question. What has a medievalist and a philologist have to do with a bunch of architects and urbanists? On my side, I accepted this very kind invitation because it's always very good to be on friendly terms with doctors, lawyers, and I have a few doctors and lawyers here in the audience as well, and of course architects. So I hope that one day I may be able to build my own house. Professor Smets has spoken here about the conflict between honors and gain. It's the story of my life. I have chosen honor, so my gains are relatively modest. So you won't be having me as a client for a few decades, but God knows. And I hope the lawyers will never have me as a client. As for the doctors, that's inevitable, unfortunately. All right, so here I am to be as neither an architect, nor a contractor, nor a client, nor a public authority. So what am I? I'm simply a member of the public. I'm just like some of you, an interested member of the public. And before I start asking Professor Smets a few questions, because he is here in the foreground, I would like to tell you my only personal history with urbanism in this beautiful city of ours, where we so pleasantly and joyfully live. Now, I live in Mănăștur, as you may have understood from the previous presentation, and I have been living in Mănăștur, apart from a few years I spent in Paris, for all my life. And I live most precisely where the McDonald's is in Mănăștur, so I have the great joy of listening to people's marile as they wait for their hot dogs, for their burgers every night. That's one of my pleasures in life. Where the McDonald's is now just in front of my windows, we live at the 7th floor, there used to be a park where we used to play when we were children. Now that park was initially invaded by the, let's say, well, entrepreneur, to use a euphemism, that appeared in 1990. Basically, they just dumped their few kiosks, iron, metal kiosks, where they sold all kinds of Turkish delights and other import merchandise. And then the park was gradually destroyed and it became a barren place. Everybody in Romania is anyway used to treading in all directions, irrespective of where the alleys were initially plotted. So whatever you architects do, you can't civilize the population. Perhaps you should wait on a barren ground to see where they cross and then finally pave it to make sure they don't go in other directions. But then it was destroyed and it became a McDonald's. Civilization arrived to Romania, the blessing of America, in the late 90s, but as they were building it, I left for France. When I came back, it was functioning. So a apart from getting fat, I could also listen to engine noise. And they also wanted to build a parking lot, because parking is a great problem in this city, and cars are a lot. And this is the first thing our Belgian guests told me. Well, they come from the country of the fiets, of the no fietseka, nu de fiets, adică biciclete, you know. In Belgium, fiets is the bikes. So they have their own fiets. Everybody has their own fiets. We have ours. And they complained about cars. Fiets in Romanian means wins. All right. And then they ultimately decided in 2009, after I had returned from Paris, to build an 8-story parking in front of our place. Actually, the parking, and here is the unethical thing, was going to be built next to a building, next to a housing building, right to a block of flats, as we call it in English. There's close to a block of flats, actually people would have the luxury of opening their windows and then jumping directly into the parking place and take their cars to drive to work. So that was progress. And of course we gathered in the street and tried to stop it. And the mayor of Cluj, who at that time was Apostu, very famous for all architects who had to deal with him, he finished his career in prison. But now he's a private developer in Dubai, I think. That's what I read, which is quite logical actually. The road is pretty linear from mayor to prisoner to Dubai investor. It makes a lot of sense. He came to my flat and I took him on the balcony and said, look where you want to build this, you idiots. You have destroyed our park, now you want to put that parking place. And he said, do you want to stop progress? Of course, as a rule, I'm not very keen on progress. I'm a medievalist. So I said, yes, basically I do. I will very much do without your progress. Why can't you make it 4 stories under the entire park and remake the park for it, on top of it, right? Put all the cars under, as you did in Leuven. Now, whereas Professor Smets doesn't have the privilege of stepping on my work, I stepped on his, because he hasn't yet trod on my books, but I trod on the square he remodeled in Leuven in front of the railway station. I've been to Leuven several times, very nice city. And he put the cars under the ground and left the top of the square for pedestrians. All right, and that was my, finally they did it. My victory was that I pushed it towards the street. If you wonder nowadays why they made it so close to the street, that's because we pushed them and they still left a few trees and didn't really build it next to the block of flats. And it was not mine, it's pretty far from mine, but I was concerned for the entire neighborhood. And I became the enemy of the town hall. I later became their colleague as well in politics, but then I withdrew. I preferred honor. All right, that's the story of my life, and I'm done with it, all right? We will go back to the main argument, ethics. Now, your beautiful topic said aesthetic, which in Romanian is a triple pun, because it's not only ethics, and you've spoken a lot about ethics, it also includes aesthetics, about which there has been very little talk tonight. And it also includes est, which in Romanian means east. So perhaps we could also compare practices east and west. And now I'm going to ask you a question in which perhaps you can compare your experience of a privileged Belgian who has always lived in a free and prosperous country, and our experience of people who were for a long time oppressed by a system who thought it was doing good actually, perhaps, although cynically perhaps they knew they weren't, but they thought they were promoting social justice, putting everybody in blocks of flats irrespective whether they were university professors, doctors, engineers or workers. That's perfect equality. In designing areas without parking lots and streets and everything, and creating a great problem in the future, because there were few cars in the 1960s and 70s when they built all this. Building without any regard to aesthetics, because in the East and in the communist ethics, what mattered is to accommodate as many people as possible. in these sorts of council housing, or HLM as they say in France, right? They were all very cheap places. Disrespecting also the built heritage of many cities. Cluj was pretty lucky to escape massive demolishment, but you know what happened in Bucharest, and actually even mention the so-called House of the People, or People's Palace in Bucharest, which actually raised an entire historical neighborhood in order to be erected. So now the question is, at one point in time, you may think that the priority of a community is something, right? For example, in the 60s or the 50s, they thought that the best thing to do is to get quickly to your job in your car. Now they think the opposite, that the best thing is to have trees all over the place. Do you think that these ethics vary not only according to a person's moral compass, but also according to time, priority, urgency? Another example, in Germany after the war, the main priority was not to rebuild the lost heritage, but to build quickly houses for the people whose houses had been bombed down, right? And this is why they built very ugly, almost as ugly as in communist Romania, all over Germany, including Western Germany, and also in parts of Western Europe. So there is a sense of urgency, and then there is a sense of ethics, and then there is also a consideration about aesthetics. Can a lack of aesthetics on grounds of social concerns be ethical? I mean, if you neglect the beauty of a building just to accommodate as many poor people as you can, for example, is this ethical? How do you view the relationship between ethics, aesthetics, and then how it varies in time? And in geography, in space, east and west? That's the first question. Several first questions.
Well, it's a very elaborate question. Maybe start with one of the elements that you mentioned, because it reminded me of what Dean Serban said to me last night. He said when one of the reasons why he went to do his architectural studies in Bucharest was because there was no longer an architecture school in Cluj. And I tried to understand why. And he explained me that in this kind of a system that you are sketching out, the government or the official building industry did not need architects. They were just following norms and, of course, erecting these horrors. So architects are not to blame in a way for the political regime in which they are living. I mean, if they want to change that, they should be active maybe in other branches. But and that is one. The other point is that the point what you make about Germany after the war, or any destroyed area, the sense of urgency vis-à-vis the longer term, or the aesthetic, or the implications. I've been involved in quite a long study, studying the reconstruction after the First World War in Belgium. And it's very intriguing because, of course, you find the same phenomenon. Urgency means, I mean, how can you speak about beauty in somebody that doesn't have anything to live in, or that doesn't have anything to feed his or her children with, and so forth? Yet, I think that in that situation, and this is exactly why I admire the number of people in the operations in the 1920s in Belgium, was that some of them had the foresight to realize that if they kept just on building, what would be the ultimate problems for the same people they were trying to serve in the beginning? And so they foresaw a development which would allow for traffic, which otherwise would be obstructed. They foresaw social services. They foresaw community squares. They foresaw, of course, the services, water, and so forth, which also didn't exist in the first urgency instances. So I think that this idea of urgency doesn't absolve us from trying to put things into perspective. I would even say the contrary. I think that one of the elements of our profession would at that time have to be to sketch out a longer term view in which the urgency gets to be a first step of a process that would ultimately lead to more quality. And it would be completely presumptuous on my side to speak about how is it when you live under the dictatorship. But on the other hand, so I'm not going to do that. And I'm not sure what you sketch out is, you began to speak about it yourself. You made a comparison with the HLM in France. I mean, there has been quite an important long period where the so-called progress, which you very finely spoke about with relation to the mayor that is now in Dubai, the so-called idea of progress has really hindered quality. I mean, the fact of the number of dwellings that had to be realized and the cheapness of it, of course, prevented to make equality. And this is very unfortunate, but it's something, in many cases, it is still existing. And if you allow me, I don't know, but I even think that in some of the elements that we have seen in Cluj, in the 60s, for instance, of some of the buildings, they have quite a number of qualities with regard to open space, and you know, that even the massive building of the 80s at least has ambition in its facades and in its monumentality, which is often lacking in the modern movement and so forth. So I'm not at all pleading or trying to find an excuse. I think, in a way, architects did what they could. When they were restricted, when everything was laid down and they could only work on the facades, at least they tried to do something with the facades. Now that is then the question, would you not have been better to be a doctor at the time, helping the people directly, than to draw somewhat nicer facades? So I think that's the same kind of an ethical problem of what is the profession today. I mean, in a way, the dilemma I try to sketch out is also whether what we can contribute is sufficient to change things in a way that we or that the society, that we would like and that the society would need. And there it is again a personal decision. But of course, for some it is easier than for others. But if you choose honor, which I think we should do, all of us, and I'm very fortunate to have been in your situation, and I'm also in your situation with regard to the implications of financials. But at least we have the honor. Well, that's basically.
All right. Now I'll talk about another problem that anyone in Cluj thinks is the top priority of this city. Actually, I'm going to go back to it. Traffic. Now here, the ethical concern varies depending on perspective. And I won't talk about Cluj, I will talk about my recent experience in Paris, where I landed at Beauvais at 8 o'clock in the morning. No, 7:30 I landed. What time do you think we ended up in central Paris? It was 11:30. 11:30. Now, the present mayor of Paris, who is a left-wing, eco-friendly, pedestrian-friendly, bike-friendly, everything-friendly apart from cars-friendly, has decided that cars should be banned from the city. Now, the city of Paris does not only belong to the happy Parisians who can afford to pay from about 10 to 20,000 euros per square meter, that is to say upwards of 700,000 euros for a little one-room flat. But it also belongs to the 10 million people who live in Ile-de-France and who work there every day, and some of them cannot come there by public transportation, although public transportation in Paris is splendid. They have the RER, they have the underground, which they are constantly expanding, and despite all that, there are too many people to arrive from all points, and some of them are forced to take their cars. Now, taking your car from outside Paris, for the luxury of Parisians who breathe better air and walk pleasantly their dog at 10 o'clock in the morning going to pick up their croissant, that obliges the people who work in the suburbs to wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning or 4 o'clock in the morning in order to be able to get there before the traffic jams start, and practically to waste 2 or 3 hours of their life, or 4, every day commuting. And it's the same for people who live in Florești as opposed to the center of Cluj. If you live in the center of Cluj, ethics would dictate to you to forbid all traffic and turn everything into pedestrian, make no parking places, and make everything beautiful and natural. And if you ask the inhabitants of Cluj, they would actually like Cluj to look very much like the countryside, to have gardens and trees and orchards, and perhaps to grow vegetables in the main square, rather than have nice, decent pavement. Ask them, and that's their main complaint, that it's not like the countryside where they come from, most of them. But if you ask the people from the outskirts, they will tell you that their interest, and that's their ethical thing, is to get here in within a decent time, right, and to be able to enjoy more of their lives doing something useful than driving. So, you see, the ethical problem is never one-sided. It's also, to say, like beauty, in the eye of the beholder. So what do we choose between this ecological drive, which has made traffic almost impossible and has generated incredible traffic jams, which is legitimate for the people who live there inside, and the interests of wider communities which in all large urban areas live farther and farther from the city center? How do we conciliate, how do we strike a balance between these two, let's say, ethical imperatives?
I like the way you put it. I think, in a way, you're maybe speaking more like a politician now than you know.
You don't expect me to speak as an architect.
No. Well, of course, the task is exactly to try and obtain this balance. And I absolutely agree that, I mean, I was talking about social injustice and about, you know, cutting off certain people. And I used this example of gated communities, but I could have used the example of the center of Paris, or the center of many of our towns that have been gentrified, to the detriment of those, the working force that has to immigrate at certain hours and get out at other hours. Now, this is extremely unfortunate, and it's, in my view, just, you know, reason. The basic reason is, of course, the whole capitalist system of land ownership and you know, the real estate values. So one of the elements could already be that now I'm talking as a politician, that you try to mitigate, and that public authority, in my view, has not only the right, but the obligation to see that it acquires land in order to prevent this kind of social Samoa, you know, the development agency, or public development agency, bought the land that from an older industry and put it back on sale for redevelopment. It was with a number of conditions. And one of the conditions, the important conditions, had to do with the, you know, the final destination of those who would be inhabiting the new thing. So they would only leave like 15% to the free market. They would have a number of social housing. They would have middle class housing. They would have, because in France they have 4 or 5 categories. But they stipulated it so that they would be sure, and the developer had to accept or not accept, but then do the job, that he would sell the high apartments so expensive that they would pay for the rent of others. Now, this is a mechanism of redistribution, which I think is admirable and should be followed in many, many other places. Now, that is one. The other, of course, has to do with the fact that inevitably you get a sort of zoning, let's not call it segregation, social zoning, and that unfortunately, you know, the distances are enlarging. So this requires, of course, in the first element, the fact that you don't, because what you are presenting, that's why I call you a politician. You are presenting it like it's inevitable that these guys that have to come into the city, they work for, come by car, and that if they cannot get there and don't have parking places, they will have hours in the car. Well, the first thing is maybe to try and make that they don't necessarily all have to come by car, that they have good public transport that very quickly, comfortably, etc., brings them to where they have to be. And that if, I mean, I'm not a specialist, but if you have a car system, there can be pooling of cars. There is a possibility of getting the cars not completely in the city center, but have them on parking spaces outside, and then use public transport, and so forth and so on. This has to be investigated case per case, but it is really too cheap, sorry, to speak about this idea as being the reason why we have to keep all our cars in the city. And I know it's an extremely difficult debate. We made, in the last years, I was very involved in a plan for the Brussels Canal Zone and the public realm and how to organize it. And what we encountered was that the poorest communities, Molenbeek, for instance, were the most aggressive with relation to the car. You could not do anything in their space because they needed to have the car. Why? Because the car was not only a question of transport, but was also a question of public status, social status. And so I know it's extremely difficult and it's a lengthy process. But if we do not in some way create a better balance, we could of course reverse that our cities are not getting to be enjoyable. And or that what you see in many places, and I think Cluj has to be very careful about this, is that you get a city historic center which then is basically upgraded because it doesn't have cars, or it has few cars, just exactly what you sketch for Paris. And because of that, it's not only the living that is upscale, but it also becomes one big restaurant, you know. And there is no other places, ultimately. Good thing that you have so many universities in your place so that they can be there. But this is also a great danger. What I think you should look at is the quality of the public realm in the periphery. And this is where we talk again about commuting, it is really more also the question of what is the quality of your daily habitat. Also, what is the potential of working at home? I mean, these people are also in the cars because they don't have enough computers or they don't have enough knowledge as other class, the wealthy have, etc. So it's rather complex, but I think it's essential that we address this also as urban planners and that we find the balance that you are looking for.
All right. There is also a third question. I don't know how many we are allowed and how long you want to stay here, but if I see people leaving, this will be the last. If you are willing to stay, then we'll coin more. All the examples you have shown from your own practice and of urban regeneration and so on concern mostly new developments or outskirts, former industrial areas. I would like also to come to a question of historic city centers, of built heritage, which should be preserved in a different way. And there is a very fine line between a house that is a monument. Now let's think, for example, Calea Mănășturi in Cluj. Small barracks, not very nice houses, right? Essentially ugly and dispensable. Small, one story, you can do without them. You can do without the houses inside the old city walls behind, let's say, where all the restaurants are. None of them is really an architectural masterpiece, although if you dig, you may find Gothic elements or old houses. So they're not particularly beautiful, but together they create a landscape that is, however, historic and beautiful. If you take them one by one, you could raise them and build something nicer. If you do so, however, you adulterate the atmosphere and the city center, and it's no longer looking medieval, it looks modern, all right? So there is also a balance of this. If you rebuild, is it recommendable to build in the spirit of your age, namely to build a new modern building? Also, ethically, it would be nice because the spaces would be better designed. You wouldn't have rooms like that, passage rooms that you have to cross in order to get to the bedroom. They would be better organized and so on, more healthy. There would be more light perhaps than in an old house and so on. So there is an ethical aspect to it. And then on the other hand, of course, there is the ethical aspect to preserving the built heritage of a city center. And that creates a problem. When you rebuild, do you rebuild in the style of the area? Do you try to create an imitation? Do you build something new? Do you build above, as it is sometimes done here, above the old house, behind it, so as not to see the new house very well and to leave the old one in the foreground? So how does ethics work with respect to built heritage? And there too, there is another appeal, once again, to urgency, to the need of people to actually live close to where they work, right? Not 40 minutes away or 10 miles or 20 miles away if they so want. So there is also the appeal to urgency, then the appeal to hosting people, to creating accommodations and so on. Public services in historical cities. Where do you strike the balance between these ethical imperatives of preserving what's old, building something new, serving the community, creating the services people need? For example, schools that need to be extended, right? Like Borg, for example. They built a second floor. I studied there for 8 years. I saw it had a third floor, and so on. So there is also a very fine line there, and I think the architects there have even more of a responsibility than the developers or the public authorities, because even if they tell you, all right, build 2 more stories on that historical building, ultimately it's the architect's job to do it beautifully, respectfully, to save as much as he can of the built patrimony. So how do you view this situation?
Yes, I think respect of the existing is the basis of any kind of progress. And answer very, very quickly and say that it is a very thin line, as you mentioned, and that it is really one of the tasks of the architect to find the balance between, let's say, the original heritage and the new kind of programs or the changing programs. I was reminded, this morning we made a walk, and two elements struck me. One was the new Bosch factory headquarters. Was Bosch, huh? Okay. And
The research headquarters
research.
on the site of the former Flacăra factory.
And what struck me very much, although this is quite a novelty, built on a parking lot underneath and so forth. One of the reasons why this intervention has so much quality is that it left a number of elements next to it in existence. And these elements get another value, and they also give another value to the new thing. Because the opposition creates a sort of a scale, not only in terms of, yes, the new has tried to adapt in a way, even though if it's 2 stories higher, to the existing, but also in terms of time. You know, you can read the history, you can keep on reading the history, and you know that this new intervention is a part of a well-meant new type of development needed for Cluj without, destroying the others. The other element which struck me very much during our walk was a number of these smaller houses that you are talking about. For me, it seems that these kind of low-scaled, basically 1 story, but I think sometimes they are 2 stories behind the facade, but with a very strong cornice, and creating a sort of homogeneity, and yet having interior patios and small gardens or small aggregated housing clusters around community gardens are a very, very, very potentially rich way of inhabitation for the future. And so, of course, you could say, what if the marketplace is left, if the development is left to the market space, people say, oh, we have a gold mine, so let's sell our house and there will be an apartment and so forth. And the city changes completely in scale. If you want to know what will happen, you have to go to Greece. This is already happened there. The other element is, of course, that you try to think about modernity as a sort of reprogramming of the city. My daughter was making the observation that these small community gardens would be excellent places for co-housing projects with young people with younger children that don't have their grandparents living next door like you, Christine, but that need a sort of a community upbringing for children, mutual services, and so forth, which you cannot do in an apartment building on the 8th floor. So this is a value, and maybe we should try and look at the city in ways of quality and not in quality of living. And what is the new programmatic evolution which we are agreeing on? And then it is the task of architects in combination. In my lecture, you cannot do anything without the public realm and without the right political assessment. So you have to be inspiring this, but the inspiration can come from the example that we are setting. And I think we have to, as I tried to mention, we have to be imagination and representing how the future could be is something very strong as a tool to make people act. And I believe in that.
What about memory and imagination? And I would like to provoke you both, if I may, with a question regarding this issue of a city that is not amnesiac. Today in our walk we came up upon this word because in several places you really feel that the transformation leads to voluntary amnesia around that area. And that those layers of small houses that we encountered and we valued for certain qualities make us think of the value, the ethical value of memory. And Professor Papahagi, in one of your earlier TV shows, it was a very interesting one with Roman Patapievich, I was very struck by the thing you said that intelligence is an extension of memory. And although it would seem the other way around, I think we would be tempted to say that memory is a function of intelligence. You are very much making a case for memory in that talk. I remember, of course, it was about gaining knowledge, but a memory that is alive, that is part of your daily life, of your daily encounters. So how would you translate that, interpret that, if I may ask you, within the city? What about memory and memory that allows for a process, or how the process could be grounded on memory? And Marcel Smets, on one of your early writings, you are mentioning about you are reflecting about the collective yard. That was the title of one of your early texts, and I think that was very inspiring about thinking of the city metaphorically. It's a collective yard. But you are making a very powerful couple of opposites in that text between what you called formal abstractions and the reality of a process that is reality grounded or community grounded or grounded on real needs, and it's developing along with negotiation. So you are making the contrast between the imposition of models as abstractions, like the successful form of a project somewhere is taken as a model, is abstracted as a form that would guarantee its success elsewhere. And you are arguing, of course, that would not work, and that the rationality has come from a process which is grounded on a place and on a context and on real needs, and the memory or the sort of ethical stance of fighting against amnesia, I think, would come about. So maybe you would both like to respond to that.
Thank you. I'm impressed that you watched that very old TV show. And indeed, I'm telling my students because nowadays in schools, everything is, people are thought they need to develop skills rather than to memorize things. You see, memorizing is something very bad. Learning poetry by heart, learning a concert by heart, learning formulas by heart, all that's very bad. What's good is to have skills. But a synapsis is between this and that. If you don't have the this and the that, there will be no synapsis at the end. So intelligence is a function of memory, of course. If you do not remember anything, then you are not cultured. If, as an architect, you no longer remember what you learned, you can't draw and plot, right? So obviously that memory is essential. Now, if we turn that from, let's say, cognition to metaphor and to civilization, I think that civilization is memorial. An animal doesn't remember things. Each animal has to reenact, to relearn the memory of his species in one individual, if you see what I mean. Whereas we humans have a written heritage. We know from history that if you invade a foreign country, it's bad, and in the end you are going to be beaten. No reference to present times. We know that if you praise I don't know what type of thing then, or if you are some sort of, have some sort of orientation, it will lead to something. Because we have memory, so memory is essential. Now, architecture for me is the most splendid of things. I'm a fan of architecture. I have been walking all over Europe and looking at buildings all my life. I go to Rome every year, I go to Paris every year, I go to London every year. I'm fortunate in that. And all I do is look at buildings. That's the only thing that interests me. And I have been thinking, of course. Now, you may see where my tastes lie, more in the past than in the present, and certainly I dread the future. The future is, I guess, and fear, right? But there is a hubris of modern architecture. And at the same time, there is also something more humane going on in urban development. I read at home a passage from a French urbanist who said that urbanism has moved from l'urbanisme de magnificence vers l'urbanisme pratique. And you illustrated that. From a magnificent urbanism, you see Haussmann, Ceausescu, Mussolini with the Eur, right, all of that, Albert Speer, very dictatorial. Now, some of it is downright horrible. Some of it, however, we consider splendid, right? Haussmann we consider splendid. Speer, not much has survived, but we consider it horrible. Mussolini, many architects say it's great, and if you look at it, it's not ugly. At any rate, it's not like Ceausescu, right? So, but still, there is an urbanism which has been more concerned with human interest, as you have shown. It's more down to scale, more humane. On the other hand, architecture seems to have been doing the opposite. It becomes more and less human. There is a hubris going on. Now, my son lives in New York, and of course we go there from time to time, and they have just built a new JP Morgan building on Park Avenue. Now, that's the tallest bank. Who has the tallest, who has the biggest building and bank? It reminds me of Bologna in the Middle Ages when they were building all those stupid towers, and it looked like Manhattan, really. Now, only 3 of them are still standing. You spoke in your book on urban design about the difference between tower and belfry, right? There are some buildings that have a function that send to a moral community that actually means something to the community, and others that are pure hubris. Let me show that I'm the greatest architect and do something totally absurd, totally useless, but totally spectacular. So there are 2 different directions, all right? But I have gone a bit far from your question about memory and intelligence. Architecture today seems to have lost the memory of any given space. A modern building in Cluj looks exactly like a modern building in Nantes, in Bruges, in wherever. Whereas an old building in Bruges will never look like an old building in Cluj or even London. It will look like a building in Anvers or Antwerpen or Leuven, but certainly not like one in Paris. Maybe like one in Lille, but not like one in Paris, and one in Paris won't look like one in Nice, and one in Nice won't look like one in Genoa, and one in Genoa won't look like one in Naples, more or less, and one in Germany, and so on. So memory also involves a sense of respect for what you are and where you are, right, and what you are. Whereas architecture nowadays seems to be, how should I say, to want to be something else and somewhere else and sometime else. The result is that you get anonymous cities, and we will get Asian cities. Everything will look like Shanghai, and of course that's spectacular. But you can't tell that you're in Europe or Asia or anywhere. There is no local thing. There is no local spirit. There is no memory of a space, of a heritage, of a community, of a history, of anything. So my plea is obviously in this respect for memory also as a form of respect, of belonging. You can't build anyhow, anywhere, as if you were nowhere, right? And that's something that is, of course, I think architects know it, because on the way you want to be in the trend of your age, and you want your buildings to look contemporary and spectacular and impressive. But on the other hand, you also have to look what's next to it, and so on. So that's another huge dilemma which architects have. And I will say something in favor of architects. Now, since the Middle Ages, architects are no longer the builders themselves, right? You are no longer maçons. You are now intellectuals like me who think something very abstract sometimes, and then the builders come and build it, and it's not ultimately even your responsibility if it falls on people's heads. It's only your responsibility if it's ugly. That's your responsibility, I think. But it's not your responsibility if it falls on people's head or if it doesn't respect it, more or less, I think. But of course you plot it, but the others, yeah, well, I'm not very familiar with technical things, but maybe it is, but less so. But on the other hand, an architect's creation is made of stone or bricks. It will be there for a very long time, unless you demolish it, which is very expensive, right? So the responsibility is even higher, because if you are a bad poet, nobody will read your poetry, no harm to society. If you're a bad painter, nobody will buy your paintings, or they will put them in the, in the storehouse. They won't display them, or just people with poor taste will buy them, or your relatives. If you are a bad singer, nobody will listen to you. But if you're a bad architect and you got a public contract and you build something, it will affect everybody for a very long time, right? So architecture has a lot more responsibility than, let's say, the minor arts, which initially were just part of it, right? Sculptures, paintings were part of architecture. Now they have become more or less autonomous. And here, indeed, the ethical responsibility of architects is much higher than that of other artists, because you are artists yourself. And in Greek, art is called techne. You see, techne is a very good word because it means both art and technology. Your art is the complete art, because we all have technology. A poet must know prosody, no longer. A singer must know the notes, no longer. All right, good. They mustn't. I don't know. A painter must know how to draw, no longer. All right. But an architect cannot allow not to know how to make a house, right? He cannot just do Pollock things. You cannot be a Pollock of architecture, you know, like dropping bricks on top of each other and see what comes up. So your responsibility is much higher than any other artists or technicians. And this is why I stand in awe of architects. And also I find what they do can be awesome or awful. And this is how my awe is ultimately resolved, right? And so it's up to you to respect historical built heritage, to build something which is both enduring, functional, useful, cost-effective, compliant with what people need with the age, but also with the environment. I can't imagine anything more difficult than that. So good luck with all that. If that's my final word, and we never meet again until I have enough money to ask one of you to make a house for me in Fugit or somewhere.
I think there's nothing to add to what you just said.
In that case, are there questions from the audience? We would very much like to hear some questions, please. Pass the microphone if you could get nearer, please.
My name is Walid. I'm an architect and a PhD student. I have two questions, if you don't mind. The first question is, in a society where it's already segregated, there are sectarians, informal settlements, it's hard to make a difference between cementing houses and building homes. How we respond for the society needs. And the second question would be how flexible and spontaneous our plan should be. Our plan is the driver or the engine of the city.
Driver or engine?
Well, it's
the urban design plan, isn't it?
So it has to create opportunities in the sense that it searches to establish what I called coherence, but within that framework of possibilities, there should be a number of liberties which allow, of course, that the plan grows by its users, by those who live in it, finally. So I hope that's clear. For me, I can speak half an hour on it, but I think it's rather essential that we understand that a plan, or even, I mean, we're talking about an urban plan, but for me, it's also buildings. Buildings are not built for the 2 coming years. They are built for decades at least, if not centuries. And they, of course, in the course of their life, will have to undergo many kind of uses. I mean, was a cinema, it has been all these elements that were called in the beginning. Now we are sitting here, it's a fabulous kind of meeting room. So these buildings should allow for these changes, or should even inspire the changes to maintain the quality of the space, even if the activities in it change over time. With regard to the first question, I'm not really sure I understood what you meant.
The first question was the social dilemma.
Yes.
It's a social dilemma about when the society needs, it's far different from the planning. In other words, in a society, segregated societies, sectarian places, informal, where the society needs houses, infrastructures, services, economy, but actually what they should get is a fundamental of social actions, maybe. A plan for a sustainability plan, not just cemented houses, homes.
I agree.
Yeah, but the problem.
I agree, it's not a question.
Yes,
It's a statement, and I agree, you know.
Yeah, the problem is it's a very gray area where institutes, the society, they won't agree with us. We here agree all about this, but
Okay, then you should.
when we dance with the devil, it's different.
No, I agree. It's extremely difficult. I mean, even if we all believe in it, it's not happening every day. Is that what you mean? And then our action should be directed each day to try and make it happen. You know, in whatever function we are in the society. You know, but in terms of architects, as you are. It is with with trying to create possibilities, you know. Let's say, sometimes I use the word opportunities. That's already in a situation where everybody is able to use an opportunity. Sometimes it's not enough. Sometimes we have to create possibilities of change, you know, of existing situations which are not really as they should be, you know. But all of that is our collective task. And maybe going back to some of the elements that were just said, it's of course what is fundamental also about memory is that we are never acting on a clean sheet. We are acting on an existing society, on an existing settlement, on an existing landscape, on an existing city. And everything we do is transformation. And the worst transformation, of course, is thinking that you
for Mr. Papahagi. I don't have a 10-minute question, but I really enjoyed your point of view. You said that if you ask so most of the people in Cluj-Napoca, if they would rather have a garden than a parking lot, they would say that yes. I would say the opposite. I like to drive by car, so that's my point of view. How would you find Cluj to be more, to be a better city? Maybe a balance between rural and urban. And also, you said you've seen most cities in Europe. Which was your favorite and why? Thank you.
It's too many questions and very difficult. Now, it's very hard. I won't say anything about my favorite city. I like very many cities for very many things. I don't like Brussels, but I love Bruges, Gand, Anvers, and Leuven. I love Rome and everything Italian. I love Paris for various other reasons. And I love Cluj. Now, people are not objective when they live somewhere. But I have been obsessed by civilization because I'm a boy of the late communist years. We lived in a, as Trump would call it, in a shithole, in a dump. All my neighborhood was a continued construction site. I had an American teacher who came to Romania in the 1990s and from California, no less. And I asked him, what do you think Cluj looked like? And he said it looked like an unfinished building site. And indeed, that was it. And that's what most third world places look like. You see, it's buildings that are half finished, the function is there, but the beauty is not there, the aesthetics. They don't care for the common space. They don't care for the common good. So long as inside it's comfy, that's good for them. Civilization is, of course, caring for the common spaces. Now, from this point of view, Cluj has become incredibly better than it ever was in the past I knew from the late 80s. I was born in 76. People are complaining, but they don't realize that a lot has improved in this city. Now, if there are more cars, it's also because cars have become cheap and because people have become richer here. And they can afford it, and because transportation has not developed far enough. And I will tell you something, infrastructure never develops as far as human needs and buildings. I think any urbanist can tell you that, and that's only my intuition. You will develop faster than they can make undergrounds and trains and trams and everything. So inevitably there will be a gap when you will have this discomfort. Now people say, in the 70s Cluj was so nice, they had flowers and plants and no cars. Yeah, because people were poor and we didn't have gas, and you could only drive every other Sunday, and you had to wait for 2 days to get a full tank. And it cost a quarter of your salary anyway. So we are complaining, but we are living better. Cluj has developed, I think, inside the city nicely, outside chaotically. And precisely because urgency has come in front of any other urbanistic interests. And now it's very difficult to remedy that. Now, how could Cluj become better? Obviously, with infrastructure, here the answer is correct. I don't know if the solution is correct. I don't know why they couldn't make a train from Dej to Huedin, crossing that bloody hill, and that would be it. Why do we need an underground in a city of under 500 with all the metropolitan area, which will never reach 1 million because it's hilly and it's complicated, and we are Romania, not France or England, rather than doing a train and perhaps some huge parking lots nearby, and the train mainly exist. Now I'm talking here local matters, but they could just cross the hills and you would have the train on the other side, pull it to Florești and solve the problem and get them all to the railway station in 10 minutes or 5 with commuting trains. I mean, the solution that has been found, solutions are not always, the problems are real. They are striving, they haven't always found the best solutions, but I think there must be a balance between cars and living space. I agree with that. Not everybody can have a car. In Paris, only 40% of the population own a car to begin with. A car is not a right, because it's not your right to park it everywhere, or to park it on someone else's parking spot, or to park it in front of someone else's house, or to park it on the public space without paying. So there's not a right to park a car. It's a right to have it, but not to use it in a city as you wish. That's the first thing, and people should understand that. And I think BOK is doing the right thing, trying to discourage this type of abusive parking. They're doing it even in Bucharest. On the other hand, you must understand that the city is developing also because all these new people are coming and they are working here. And if you don't have that working force, the city will stop. You can't stop all development. So you must also be tolerant to the fact that the poor fellow from Florești doesn't want to wait 20 minutes for that stupid bus which only comes twice an hour or thrice an hour, and which doesn't even stop where it should, right? And he has to take his child to school because he doesn't have one over there. So I think society should tolerate that there is always a gap between urban development and infrastructure. That's what I think. And people forget that too often in Cluj. We have lost patience. And I think even so great steps are being done. Public transportation in this city, at least inside the city, has become very good indeed. And most people don't recognize that. And I don't think that the paving of the city center is ugly. If you go to Vienna, you will see that there are almost no trees on most streets. There are trees on every street in Cluj. But people would like to have gardens. You can't have gardens in the city center. In the city center you have pavement. It's a city, it's not the countryside. In the countryside you have gardens if you want to go. So we still have more gardens and more trees. Cluj is relatively green. Does it strike you as relatively green? Yes. People don't see that. Also, yes, and it's surrounded by hills and forests. That also makes it nice because from every point in the city you see the limits of it. So it's not an infinite questo popoloso deserto che appellano Parigi, said La Traviata. It's not a populous desert. It's not an urban, it's not Cairo or the favelas in New Mexico. It's humane. You see the nature, you see the hills, you see that there is an end to it and a way out, an escape from the city. So it's livable. I don't see why people are complaining so much about Cluj, actually.
Are there other questions? Please.
Hi. I wanted to ask, sorry if I speak badly, but I wanted to ask something in matters of ethical and in matters of dancing with the devil, and it's probably more towards you, Mr. Marcel. The question is, how do we react as professionals, me not being a professional yet, but looking forward to it, to unethical practices that already happened, that, for example, become malignant, and they require further investment and further investigation, and they sort of work as a domino piece, and they make the city lose its balance in a way. How do we react as professionals? Do we segregate it? Do we punish it? Somehow do we react? How do we not encourage it, but also not making this functional because it's a loss of space and material already happening? Thank you.
I think you probably you have examples in your head that it would make easier if we were on the spot and were to be able to discuss this particular example. So my answer may be too general and maybe because of that relatively problematic. It's true that there is an argument that is, in my view, is often a political argument of we have made this choice, and if we do not continue, then it will be, even more detrimental to what is already which ultimately became so uninhabitable that it was a concentration of crime, drugs, everything, you know. And that in the end, you know, what do you do in a situation like that? There is an investment already there, but you cannot go on and so forth. I don't think, you have to be careful not to continue in sin or to continue in stupidity, you know. Something, as a society, we all make mistakes, but this is not an argument to continue making mistakes, if you understand what I mean. Now, again, maybe you have elements, there is, of course, at certain point, you could make an argument that also bad buildings are potentially transformable and could improve in certain ways if you deal with them. That is also an argument, you know, the buildings are ruins. I mean, there is many social housing, for instance, that is completely of the 60s, 70s, I mean, new movement, that is completely in terms of climate change and problems of energy and so forth is completely detrimental. But in my view, it's not a reason why you should destroy them. You can absolutely foresee a new skin on the outside, which then provides for, you know, much better dwelling quality in terms of insulation and so forth. So that's a good example of how things that are not working can eventually be again made to work. The question is, what is the potential of the existing, in my opinion? You know? And is the existing something that can that allows to fulfill much more than it does actually, or it makes it impossible, or it's. I'm not very tempted to destroy buildings, to be very honest, as a general element. But maybe there are situations where we should be merciless.
Is there another question from the audience? Is there just maybe a last question or remark? Is there a common sense maybe about ethical action? Is common sense an instrument for ethical action maybe? Because I'm thinking of this notion of common sense. In Romanian is bun simț. It's rather different because it has the goodness, so the ethical, and the simț, which is the aesthetical, the perceptional, bound together. And the common sense in English, maybe it's a question, it's a philological one also. Philosophical, and also why the difference of the same notion being named differently, and how maybe we can relate to that in terms of ethical action in the city.
Okay, just let me end not on the word merciless, because that would be terrible for a night. And maybe respond very quickly to what you say. I really believe that the involvement of the people that are going to be affected by the intervention you have in mind is essential. And that, mind you, because there is also populism now, you know?
The void.
Yes, but so it's not only a question of having the people speak, it's your duty, our duty, to inform the people about all the possible alternatives, and then organize a process in which the common sense may prevail. That's why I also made the comparison with the medical doctors. You know, they have the obligation to engage in a discussion with the client, looking at the potential cures, and instead of thinking that we are the geniuses that invent the world.
The owners of the solution. Don't own the solution. Professor Papahagi, would you like to add something?
Something funny just to finish it. No, it's not going to be funny. No, it's going to be deep. Now, joking. About common sense, you see the English call it common, the French call it bon. And we call it bon because we like to imitate the French rather than the English. But bunul simț, le bon sens. We all know what Descartes said, le bon sens est la chose au monde la mieux partagée, which means common, good sense, let's say, let's keep it good sense, is the commonest thing. So he means that good sense is common as well. But he doesn't mean it in the sense that we all have common sense. If you talk to people, you will find that very many of them lack common sense. So it's not that common after all. What Descartes meant was actually that it's la mieux partagée, it's best divided actually, best shared, in the sense that you can find it where you least expect it and you can not find it where you would expect it. For example, you can find educated men who completely lack common sense or bon sens, and you can find a simple peasant who is full of common sense, sound bon sens, right? So what he says is that in a way it's democratically shared. And now, if you think of architecture in medieval times, there was no urbanism in medieval times. They built organically, and this is why streets often go like this and they're narrow. He doesn't really agree, but nobody, I saw him nodding, but people didn't say, all right, let's draw an avenue here and destroy everything else to make space. No, they built, so there was a vernacular, commonsensical understanding of the common good and the common need. They understood that they should leave a causeway for their cars to go through, and if they didn't, they wouldn't go through. They understood that they needed not to build everything, to leave a central square for common interest, common markets, common gatherings. They understood, for example, that the most important building in a city was not the aristocrat's palace. It was a church, which belonged to everybody, because everybody could go in. It was not anyone's in particular. The last of the beggars could go there like the most important person in that city. So they understood the common good in a way naturally, and not because they were smarter than we are, but because there was more of a commonality, of a sense of the community. Now communities have become incredibly larger and more complex, right? A city like Cluj no longer has 4,000 inhabitants or 3,000 that all know each other. So it's no longer a great village. And consequently it has become very complicated to negotiate the common good and to rely on the public common sense. And yet, I think that common sense should not be discarded. And I think that what you said at the very beginning is that morality and ethics cannot be practiced by the book. It's not like law. It depends very much on one's moral compass. So I think that every community ultimately, after many failures and trials, ultimately reaches some sort of common sense. In Romania, we had everything was planned and decreed from a central authority. They knew how to build houses, how many blocks, how many streets, how many schools, how many. In Bucharest, they even wanted to build some huge restaurants or cafeterias to feed everybody, and then get away with all shops and everything. Everybody would go there and fixed hours, be fed, all the same thing, and then go back home. They were called, how were they called in Bucharest? Circul foamei, no? The circles, the arenas of hunger. Yeah, and it's true. Ceausescu built several round structures like that. One of them was turned into the first shopping mall in Romania. That's also something, a telltale story. It's close to where my wife lives in Bucharest. She's from Bucharest. What I'm saying, from this over-reglementation in 1990, people wanted to break free. Everybody wanted to build a private house. Everybody wanted to build a a shop and they didn't care for anything. They didn't care for the common good. And now it's the tide. Now we have become civilized enough and rich enough and considerate enough, and we realize all the harm that has been done with this chaotic building and ugly building, and we are trying to mend. So I think that society ultimately finds its common ground and common sense, although it's not always the same thing at different historical periods. And this is why I'm optimistic that architecture, even when it's ugly, can be repurposed in a way, and can be redeemed in a way. And I hope this is going to happen also in communist countries, where so much has been destroyed, but luckily not everything. Yes. But let's thank our guest of honor who is here, Professor Smets. I would like him to have the last word, and I would like to thank you. This is my last word now for being here. It's already past midnight, so we should all go back to our homes, well-built homes, beautifully decorated, and in a very sound urban surrounding. All right, Professor Smets.
Let me thank you for being here, being able to address you. And as you see, I prepared something, but technicalities often work against it. But anyway, I want to congratulate Bienala with this theme, because I think it's very timely. At least it made me think. I have never worked on ethics, so you gave me the opportunity to reflect on things that were new to me. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, everybody. And as a last call, please don't forget tomorrow, Auditorium Maximum. From 10 o'clock, we have Opera Omnia, a special ceremony for 2 architects, valuable architects. And then at 12 o'clock, we have the conference of the jury. And at 17 p.m. Or 5 p.m. is the final gala, and my colleagues are now moving something. It's an art. It's something made by Ana Maria Burzog, and she's gonna tell us everything about it because it looks astonishing, and she's been doing that for the last 2-3 hours, right?
So hello, I'm Ana Maria Burzog, part of Arhitecții Collective. Maybe you heard of our activities. And for today, I listened to the wonderful presentations and the discussion, and I tried my best to represent it visually through some key elements. I tried to summarize what was told. You can come closer and look at it. And I had a lot of fun listening to it, and I hope I did it justice. And yeah, you can search our activity as Activistory on Instagram if you're curious, and I hope you like it, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh my God. And don't forget about the pictures, a group picture and everything. And have a nice evening, everybody. Bye-bye.